Hi, everybody. This is Jeff Smith, creator, writer, director of Stella B and the Busted League, and this is my jam packed commentary track. Everything you could possibly want to know about Episode 2 Rory Gilmore is Bleeding. To start, the title of this episode is a tribute to one of my favorite comedians, Christopher
Botticelli!
Titus, and his superb comedy
Miss
special, Norman
Botticelli!
Rockwell,
I
is
would
Bleeding.
speak with you.
Episode 2 is my
Where
personal
do I want
favorite
to
among the
go?
5 that we did because the finished product most closely
You and
matches the
I
script
have
and the ideas I
unfinished
had in my head when
business,
first putting this
Miss
show together.
Botticelli.
While episode 1 largely serves to introduce the characters so the audience could get a sense of their personalities, this episode set out to show a bit more scale to demonstrate that it wasn't just about them hanging around in the comic book
Mr.
store,
McSorley,
but
I
was
don't
about the
appreciate
broader
you talking
strokes of
like
their
that.
I have
lives.
been trying to contact you for
That
weeks,
said,
Miss
we open here
Botticelli.
just moments
You
after
have
the close
been
of episode
ignoring
1
my
at Titan Comics, where
electronic
Stella is
mail.
confronted by the evil,
Most
or at least
improved.
This is a
unsavory,
private matter.
Reggie
It's no
McSurley,
small
played by the
inconvenience
magnificently
having to
talented
Not
Kevin
here.
Thrasher.
All I
The name
require
Reggie
is for you
McSurley
to
is a
take the
combination of
status of
Reggie
manager.
Mantle, the
Here.
villain from the Archie comics, and a guy I used to work with at Heritage Comics, whose last name was
Such a
McSurley.
square. Try to
I'd
horse.
never heard the name before, and it sounded like a funny name for a villain, so I absconded with it for
However,
this
I would
character.
advise you not to take
Reggie
my
is actually
nickname,
based
for
on a
there
real
will be
person, but more on that in a little bit.
consequences.
Kevin, I
Consequences.
believe, had borrowed this
What? You want to go
suit
to a comedy
from a
club
local
or
dinner
catch me?
theater, the Pocket Sandwich Theater,
Consequences?
and this green sales tag left under the armpit was an extra bit of added comedy, not planned. These last couple of shots where Stella turns back to the others and their reactions was a pickup shoot we had to do at the 11th hour because, quite
I
honestly,
don't want to
I
talk
missed
about it.
them on the original shooting day. I called a wrap without realizing I'd forgotten those last couple of beats, so we had to set up a special shoot after closing on a weeknight. You'll notice Becky is missing because Alexis didn't make it to the pickup shoot. A bit of trivia here, these close-ups of Dan and Alexis that were used as their title credits were actually footage from the first version of the promo film Snack Attack, which we shot on the very first day of filming. Unfortunately, the wide-angle shots from that shoot were all out of focus, and we ended up having to reshoot the promo at a later time. But these close-ups were good, so I used them in the credit sequence. Waste not, want not. These opening titles are, of course, very Doctor Who inspired because when you're finally doing the web series you always wanted to do, you throw in anything you can think of, like Batman transitions and Who style credits. So we get a sneak peek at the dinosaurs in this sequence here, this dream sequence. Any kind of special effects for the series were done by my friend Graham Quince and his wife Debbie, who are in the UK. They always delivered great stuff. The video game sequence later on in the episode was created by them as well. This was obviously based on footage I had shot at Dinosaur Park in Glen Rose. Graham fancied it all up, made it look all weird and dreamy, and I think I even layered a couple more filters over it to make it look even weirder. And the cast had a lot of fun doing these dinosaur voices because, it's always a dream. This sequence was shot on April 28th, 2012, at Jocelyn's apartment. Like most shows at this budget level, the actors just wore their own clothes in most cases. But every once in a while, I'd have something specific in mind I wanted for a particular scene. This t shirt Jocelyn is wearing is something I'd owned for years. I never wore it, it was just an odd bit of ephemera I'd collected. And I wanted to put it into the show because I loved the artwork, and it was just too big for Jocelyn, so it really only made sense to use it as a sleep shirt. Stella's obsession with coffee was born out of my love for the show Gilmore Girls, but this is an amusing instance in which the actor's personality really lines up with the character. Jocelyn is a huge fan of coffee. Unlike most TV shows, there really was coffee in that cup, and Jocelyn actually did burn her lip a little bit. And hey, there's Talina Sabbath on the cover of that magazine. Foreshadowing! An interesting aspect of the production that most people probably don't know is that our composer, Andy Waldron, didn't score the show in a typical fashion, syncing sound to picture. With the accelerated production and post-production schedule, I really didn't have time to wait until I had a 100% locked edit before sending it out for music. So I would give Andy a rough idea of what I needed and an approximate length, and he would send me finished music. Sometimes we would go back and forth a bit on a particular composition, and sometimes I would have to edit the music slightly to fit my needs. Real quick, if you look at the extreme left side of the screen here, you can see the shadow of the script bobbing in a couple of times. I also had a library of short transitional pieces he had done that I could draw from, and even a few bits of music he'd composed before the series even started. Andy always got what I was looking for, such as this quirky texting music. Andy's work was always fantastic. Great stuff. When Jocelyn texts, "I less than 3 you, Doc," the captions were deliberately positioned so that it looked like the monkey was wearing glasses. Hey, post-production is a long process, and you take your fun where you can get it. Ben's side of these various conversations was shot at the home of actor Bill Ottstadt, and if you look at all the signed photos behind Doc here, you'll see that they all say "to Bill" rather than "to Doc." I covered this in a later episode script where I mentioned that Doc lived with a roommate named Bill who did a lot of traveling based on his autograph collecting needs, but we didn't eventually shoot it because it just wasn't needed. This kitchen scene and the table sequence later in the episode were shot at the home of Laura's sister, Grace Lavrin. She and her husband, David, were very generous in allowing us to shoot at their house on multiple occasions, including us taking over the entire place for a weekend to shoot episode 3. If you look in the background of several shots set in Doc's apartment, such as this one, there are posters of the pulp hero Doc Savage. I was and am a big Doc Savage fan, and it always made sense to me that our Doc would also be a fan, given their shared nickname. Another poster like this pops up in episode 4. This was intended as a subtle bit of character definition, showing that Doc is a fan of Doc. In the script, it was Taylor Lautner that Karen thought was dishy, but on the day, Laura thought that Lautner was way too young for her to be lusting after. She had a point, so it was changed to a more age-appropriate Gerard Butler. There is actually a film called Kiss Me Stupid from 1964, a Billy Wilder film no less, with Dean Martin and Kim Novak. But I didn't check that at the time. I just thought it was a funny title for some Richard Curtis rom-com. This necklace that Laura is wearing, she told me she had picked it out as something that Karen would always be wearing because her late husband Eddie had given it to her. And I just thought that was such a lovely bit of character building on Laura's part. She's so great in this role. I really love this little sequence with Dan asleep on the couch. This is my actual answering machine. I just shot this little pickup shot of the machine going off in my apartment, and it's very weird to hear this message again because we haven't had this phone in years. We did Doc's dialogue live on the day, recording it off a speakerphone while Dan reacted in real time. This is, again, Bill's apartment, and the Stay Puft doll belonged to him. Dan muttering no was his own improv, and it makes me laugh every single time. So Joey Dietz, a.k.a. Longbox Larry, worked in this building and was able to let us in to film on several weekends. I really liked this open-air atrium layout. I thought it was very interesting visually. The construction of this episode was an experiment I wanted to try. The events unfold in the order of their importance, which is not necessarily strictly chronological. I don't remember exactly, but this was most likely inspired by Tarantino's script for Pulp Fiction, which also plays around with the sequence of events. So here we see Nick Caldwell and also Jason the X Dilworth. Jason and his buddy Chris Danger were good friends of the show and invited us onto their podcast, the Untitled Super Cool Nerd Show, very early on, which was one of the few pieces of outside promotion we got while the show was actually running. So the scene introduces Lance Diver. The character was more or less transplanted from an earlier short film script I'd written about an incredibly hubristic and obnoxious fan film director. I'd met a few guys like this over my many years in fandom, guys whose ego and boastfulness about their work really didn't seem to match up with much in the way of real-world accomplishments. So I thought it would be fun to lampoon that kind of thing as part of the Stella series. Nick Caldwell was one of several people who answered a general casting call I put out in a local online newsletter. I hadn't even really started thinking about casting Lance yet, but Nick seemed like the perfect fit, and he totally nailed the audition. I couldn't imagine anybody else coming in and doing a better job, so I offered him the part right then and there. Fan films are kind of a hardcore nerd thing, and I did worry that a general audience might be confused by the term. How is a fan film different from a regular film, and why do people make them, etc. But in the end, I figured this show was always going to be pitched to a pretty pop culture savvy audience, so I just went with it and hoped that context would be enough. On this whiteboard to her right, Alexis started spelling out the word continuity between takes, one letter at a time. You can see it in some of the shots. She's a caution, that girl.
fully financed.
The Crimson Storm concept emerged from just thinking about what would be the worst possible idea for a superhero ever. Not sure if this is the absolute worst, but it's certainly bad enough. And I had some fun satirizing certain comics that, to me, are in very poor taste, or at least very badly done, and yet somehow have a massive following. Here to Lance's right, and on the front of the desk, you can see a couple of posters I put together for supposed previous Lance Diver productions. Oh, there it is, continuity. These posters were fun to do, but they were the kind of thing that usually had me at Kinko's at 1 a.m. Before a 7 a.m. shooting day trying to get everything finished. So this is the day that our producer, Stephanie Jackson, was unhappy with me. Most of the cast and crew did theater work during the period we were shooting the series, and at this time, Stephanie was the stage manager of a particularly stressful production of Legally Blonde. The night before we shot this scene was the play's premiere after a really tough tech week, and Stephanie was like, "Please, Jeff, don't schedule a shoot the morning after my opening. I'm going to be super tired and stressed out. Can we please do this some other time?" But I'd already been in contact with Nick and Jason and Alexis and Joey, and it was a good day for everybody else. And I'd learned that you shouldn't tempt fate if a schedule works for multiple people. So I just said, "Steph, you don't have to be there. It's a simple scene. We can get it. Just stay home and rest." But that's not how Stephanie is wired. So she came in, she worked the scene, and she was miserable. But we got through it, and it just really goes to show what a conscientious person she is. I've said it many times, but I literally could not have done Stella B without her. While shooting is always the most fun part of filmmaking, my second favorite thing is actually editing. Some people consider editing to be a dreary, tedious task, and it certainly is a solitary process for the most part. But for me, it's where the film really starts to come alive and feel like a living entity. I really enjoy it. That said, a director can trip up an editor on occasion, especially when they're the same guy. The end of this scene with Nick and Alexis occasionally breaks the 180-degree rule, a rookie mistake that I didn't realize while on the location. I covered it as best as I could, but sometimes the footage just isn't there. This exterior shot we begin with is the apartment complex where I was living at the time. I basically just walked out onto the front porch and pointed the camera at a different building. The interior is Bill Ottstadt's apartment again. In making a show like this for basically no money, we were always at the mercy of everyone's schedules, and at times we were short on crew. In particular, I really could have used a director of photography or at least a dedicated cameraman. But instead, I ended up shooting pretty much everything myself. This had the unfortunate effect of drawing my focus so completely, trying to make the shots look as good as possible, but sometimes other things got neglected. For instance, on this day, we didn't have a boom operator. Our usual guy, the awesome James Donovan, had a prior commitment. I wasn't too worried about this, though, because the guys never moved from this couch. So I rigged up a mic on a stand and hung it above them just out of frame. It worked fine as far as capturing the dialogue, but if you look at the close-ups of Dan, you can see the black mic stand behind him. Silly mistakes like this happened because even with all the amazing help I was getting, I was still being stretched too thin to really do my best work, although I certainly did try. Unfortunately, the situation didn't really improve as the season went along, but I did the best I could. This is definitely my least favorite scene in the episode in terms of the writing, because a lot of the dialogue now strikes me as being a bit clunky and too cutesy. The boys did their best with the material as it was, but the scene really could do with some fine-tuning. This sequence is another tribute to my mad love for the show Gilmore Girls, probably one of my 10 favorite shows of all time. Well, at least the first 5 seasons or so. When in doubt, quote the Zaz team, specifically in this case, Hot Shots Part D. I really like that lamp of Bill's sitting on the table back there. I think it's very cool looking. And those are all my Doctor Who action figures on the table beside it. Once again, these Starhammer Apocalypse graphics were done by Graham and Debbie, and they look really cool. I really love this little musical cue that Andy did for the various days of the week. It just strikes just the right sort of punchy note, and I really get a kick out of it. Sad Stella is sad. Jocelyn did a really nice job with this scene, and Andy came up with a really great musical cue. Stephanie Jackson, our producer, gave me a great note on this scene. In the earliest cut, there was no voiceover about who the guy in the photo was. I was just assuming that people would remember the brief dialogue from episode 1 about Stella breaking up with a guy. But Steph pointed out very correctly that I needed to remind that audience who this guy was and why Stella was sad. So I laid in this dialogue from episode 1, and that did the job. The guy in the picture is Brad Davidson. He was in an improv group with Jocelyn, and they were doing a performance at the Pocket Sandwich Theater. I literally ran up there, snapped this picture just before they went on. I liked how the matching shirts made them look like one of those overly cutesy dress-alike couples. But really, it was just sort of the uniform of their improv troupe. I mean, look at it. How cute is that monkey? You gotta love that t-shirt. That's why I needed it to be in the show. This is the Cinemark 17 at Webb Chapel and Highway 635 in Dallas, Texas, just a block or so from Titan Comics. Laura drove this candy apple red Charger for many years. I don't know if she still has it or not. But it was the perfect car for Karen. One silly thing that always tickles me when I watch this episode is that airplane flying by in the background. Just the fact that nobody who was on that plane has any idea they were being immortalized in a web series. As I said, this movie theater was literally about a block away from Titan Comics. And so, after a morning of shooting at the store, the actors changed clothes, and we drove over there and started shooting. This was a no-budget series, as I've said, so we never had permits or permission to shoot in these public places. And this was probably the most worried I ever was, that somebody would come out and yell at us or call the cops. But it didn't happen. In fact, nothing like that ever happened over the 9 months it took us to shoot this show. Casting for the series was done in a fairly traditional manner. The first person cast was Laura. I met her through a mutual friend, and she was perfect for the role of Karen. Once she was on board, she immediately pitched in to help with casting the rest of the series. I placed a notice in The Column, which is an online newsletter serving the Dallas theater community. They would post audition announcements for free, and there was a fairly strong response to that. Meanwhile, Laura was letting a lot of her actor friends know about the series, and they set up appointments as well. I rented a studio at a local theater, and we did several rounds of auditions, with Laura and myself reading with a couple dozen candidates for the lead roles. Through this process, we got Jocelyn, Ben, and Dan to sign on, as well as Nick Caldwell. I still wasn't finding just the right Becky, though, so we did another round of auditions a month or so later, and somebody suggested Alexis. She came in and read, and she was just the right fit with the rest of the people I'd already cast. So we finally had our Busted League. And we're back at the Lavrin house. Laura used to call this Hotel Lavrin because she was living there at the time. In the script, the Busted League meeting was held at a rec room associated with Paul's apartment complex. But rather than try to scare up another location, we just reset the scene to be at Karen's house. The scene also introduces a lot of cookies and cupcakes and food that nobody touches, because scenes with actors eating tend to be a nightmare to edit. One of the most fun things for me as a writer was to mix up the scenes as far as who was interacting with who. Most of these tended to be one-on-one scenes. Stella and Doc, Doc and Paul, Paul and Larry, Stella and Karen, Karen and Becky, etc. It was always fun to explore the different dynamics between the characters. Doc complaining about gathering on a Saturday night was supposed to be a little bit of subtext, that perhaps this group was maybe too insular for their own good. Becky is really the only one with a fairly broad social landscape, while the others are emotionally fueled mainly by the Busted League itself. It's not something that was ever emphasized, but was a little nugget of contextualization that I was trying to slip in there. For the record, I've never done a microbrew because, among other reasons, I don't drink. But if I did one, it would probably taste about as bad as this. And for anyone who is saying to themselves, it's supposed to be evening, and yet it's still bright outside, well, you need to spend more time in Texas. Note that Karen promises there are cream horns, and yet there are none in evidence anywhere on the table. Maybe they're still in the kitchen. Doc's gag about the beer tasting like Hitler was inspired by Amanda Palmer's brilliantly hilarious song, Vegemite. If you haven't heard it, look it up on YouTube. And also notice that as bad as he says the beer is, Doc keeps drinking it. The hard cut is a classic comedy technique, and honestly, I was very happy to be able to stage this one. It's one of my favorite moments in the episode. Part of why I did Stella was to teach myself to make films, and I learned an important lesson on this episode and this sequence in particular, which was to be very aware of clocks in the background. Obviously, scenes like this aren't shot in real time, and if there's a clock visible, once the scene is edited together, the hands or the readout is going to jump all over the place, such as the small white clock behind Stella does. Granted, the audience should be paying attention to the dialogue and the performances, but stuff like this can be very distracting once somebody notices. So, yeah, lesson learned. This flashback to the doll show was shot at the same school activity room that we used in episode 1. It was nice and big and had the right sense of scale for mocking up these convention tables. This is definitely something that indie comic book creators do. They set up at shows that are not strictly comic book shows, doll shows, nostalgia conventions, stuff like that. I've definitely done a few weird shows like that in my time. I had set up some of my 12-inch G.I. Joe collection in the background, although you hardly see them in the final edit. One little Easter egg would be the very deliberate placement of Reggie's cane as he stands at the table. This sepia tone look was an experiment to give this flashback kind of a dreamy appearance. This was done through a setting on my camera, although if I was doing it today, I would most likely shoot it clean and then treat it in post-production. But it works fairly well. Jocelyn's delivery of the single word, specialized, is one of my favorite bits of performance in the entire series. As I said, I really enjoy doing the one-on-one scenes between the various characters, but there is nothing better than when the entire Busted League is together in one scene. While we were filming this scene, there was a terrible thunderstorm, and a lot of people around town had hail damage and smashed windshields and such. Unusually for us, the sound of loud hail on the roof didn't cause us any problems because I knew that all of this footage was going to be silent and have a voiceover on top of it. So we just kept on filming even through some extremely loud storm noise. This idea of someone commissioning an erotic sketch is unfortunately based on real life. When I was self-publishing comics in the early 2000s, I would set up at every convention I could, and selling sketches of various characters was a big part of the income you could expect to make at any given con. There was one very odd guy who used to come around to every show, and he would always try to commission dirty sketches from all the artists. And the weird thing was, he didn't want just a famous character in their birthday suit. He wanted himself drawn in the picture as well, fully clothed, standing next to the naked character with his arm around her or whatever. So yeah, this guy became sort of notorious in the Dallas comic art community, and he was the inspiration for Reggie, although I did tone down the skeevy factor considerably. Now, the implication here is not supposed to be that Paul knows more about comic history than Doc. Far from it. Doc is basically a comic book encyclopedia. But Doc is also more than a little tipsy at this point, and the brain fuzz causes him to confuse such basic facts as who did what in the creation of Superman. It is next to impossible not to laugh when Ben Bryant is bonking Dan Tuttle on the head with a rubber Mjolnir. And I have the outtakes to prove it. The idea is that Doc, who rarely loses control, as Paul indicates, gets freaked out by his behavior in this meeting, causing him to swear off the Tranya completely, something that is demonstrated in later episodes. I suspect I may have been too subtle with this aspect of the script, but that was the thinking behind it. So let me take this opportunity to rave about my cast. Whenever you write a script, you have certain things in your head about the characters, but I was determined to keep an open mind about the casting process and try to be open to things that I had not necessarily envisioned. I was actually quite surprised at the amount of really talented people who auditioned for a non-paying show like this, and I ended up with a fairly broad pool of talent to choose from. But even so, the choices were fairly easy, and I was completely blown away by the cast I was able to assemble. I don't need to tell you, gentle viewer, how good they are. You can see it for yourself. But I can tell you how amazingly enthusiastic, energetic, and professional they were, every last one of them. I was truly blessed to have them on my show. And this flashback scene was just a nightmare. We had scheduled it very early on a Sunday morning in order to avoid crowds and basically just other people walking around in our shot. But just as we were preparing to shoot, a maintenance crew pulled up, started unloading equipment, and began sandblasting these marble slabs which are all around the square, which made a hellacious noise. We sat and waited and watched them do this for almost an hour before they finally took a break, and we ran over to these horse statues and shot all of this in about 15 minutes. insult to injury, when I got home later that day and reviewed the footage, I discovered that I had left the microphone battery running the entire time we were waiting, and it had begun to run down. We got the dialogue, but it sounded very staticky and bad, and I had to ask my friend David Nagel, another buddy in the UK, to do a lot of cleanup before it was usable. Just to show you how dedicated these actors are, Kevin Thrasher actually drove out to a location where we were shooting a completely different scene, just so I could record this evil laugh he does at the end of that scene. He'd done the laugh on the day, of course, but I wanted a longer version that I could stretch over the shot of Stella when we returned to the table. And believe it or not, this gibberish that they all spout at Stella here was actually scripted, although they did all improvise a little bit at the end. It did the trick of just merging into a cacophony of sound that completely overwhelms Stella. So, Dinosaur Valley State Park in Glen Rose, Texas, about 90 miles southwest of Dallas. I heard about this place for years because I'm fascinated by these kinds of attractions, but I'd never actually been there until we drove down on June 9th, 2012 to shoot. These dinosaurs were from a set of 9 statues created by the Sinclair Oil Company to display in the 1964 World's Fair. They were acquired by the town of Glen Rose in 1970 and have been displayed here ever since. They've been refurbished and repainted a few times, most notably the Brontosaurus, or Apatosaurus if you want to be technical, having been given a new head sculpt at one point to reflect more recent findings. I really liked the idea of this being Stella's happy place. So on this day, Laura and Dan both had conflicts and couldn't go. So we made the trip with myself, Jocelyn, Ben, Alexis, and Stephanie. It was a bit of a noisy location, a lot of vehicles going back and forth, but the production value was undeniable. We were there for about 2 hours, got what we needed, and headed back to Dallas. Sadly, again, reviewing the footage that evening, I discovered there'd been another audio problem, some kind of malfunction with the microphone, and about half the dialogue was unusable. We had always planned to do some pickup shots later, locally, to include Dan and Laura in the scene. But now we had to use that shooting day to redo all the dialogue as well. Oh, and here comes one of my finest moments as an editor. Boom! Matching this ball sailing past at 2 different locations, 3 weeks apart. Stephanie found this nice park that was a fairly close match to Dino Valley, and we did this pickup shoot on Sunday, June 30th. The episode, in fact, debuted 3 days later on the following Wednesday, which was some quick editing on my part, if I say so myself. One battle I was constantly fighting was that I really wanted Doc to have a goatee. And while Ben was generally happy to oblige, he was also very busy doing theater work, all during the 9 months we were shooting the show, as were most of the cast. Invariably, Ben would be cast in some play that required him to be clean-shaven. This happened for the first time as we were shooting this episode, and so I had to add a line here as to why he was suddenly barefaced. There's also a tiny continuity screw-up here that I didn't notice while we were filming. In the pickup shots, Ben wore a watch that he didn't have on at Dinosaur Valley, so it periodically vanishes as the shots changed. The idea for Stella B had been percolating for several years, and in fact, I have script fragments dated as early as 2005, but the really serious work began in early 2009. The first title was Every Wednesday, a reflection of the fact that new comics are stocked on Wednesdays by comic book stores. Early versions of Stella were named Betty and Sarah and Tilly, as she and the other characters continued to develop. Then, The Variants debuted in August of 2009. The Variants was a Dallas-based web series about the lovable and hilarious employees of Zeus Comics, a real comic book store that was using the series as promotion for their sales. This took a huge amount of wind out of my sails. Although the tone of my show was completely different, I was going for more of a dramedy approach, while The Variants was geared towards goofy humor and outrageous characters. It seemed obvious that the comic store-based similarities were going to make anything I did in this general vein look like a ripoff. I shelved the entire project for a couple of months. During this period, I even worked on a couple of episodes of The Variants as an extra. In fact, Jocelyn, Laura, and Stephanie also had small roles in The Variants, although I never met any of them at that time. It was interesting to observe The Variants' process, but I already had a pretty firm plan in my head as to how to make my show. So, after a cooling off period, I got back to work on what was still being called Every Wednesday. I knew my story wasn't a ripoff, and I figured I would just do everything I could to emphasize the differences rather than the similarities. By mid-2011, I had finished the first 2 scripts, and was happy enough with them to move beyond the page and start casting this thing. I put this lightsaber outtake on here just as a bit of fun, and in the original release of this episode, it was just the raw footage. But about a year later, I got my friend Chris Mosier to put in the blades and the sound effects, and he did a great job. So it makes a really nice capper to the episode. And if you look closely, in that last moment, it really does look like Dan should be lopping off about half of his finger. It seems impossible that a decade has passed since that frantic year of 2012, but here we are. Stella B in the Busted League was a significant thing in my life, and I have nothing but gratitude for this amazing cast and crew, all of whom worked for $0. Though I did throw in a few free meals here and there. It was a great experience. Frustrating at times, exhausting, and often crazy making, but incredibly fulfilling in the end. I'm very grateful for the year or so we spent making this show. And that is about all I have to say about that. Thanks for watching, everybody.